I have been a fan and a big supporter of you for a very long time, and I seriously think that I have found a loophole in the legal system that might help you get home sooner. Being that the federal government itself was part of the effort and process of flooding the United States of America with drugs, they should be held accountable and responsible for their actions and activities as well. I believe that fact alone created the problem and climate for the drug dealing, epidemic, and environment to exist, and they should also be held accountable and responsible for their part of the conspiracy to distribute and sell illegal drugs and narcotics. The United States government conspired to traffic and dispense illegal drugs and weapons across America after conspiring and delivering them to high-level drug dealers within all of its borders. They also used their power and influence to set up these same drug dealers, using the investigative process to incarcerate them for the very same criminal activity that they are indeed involved with in the same conspiracy to distribute and traffic the same drugs that they sold to these exact same individuals. Not only did they do this, they also set up a system of drug enforcement agencies to seize the profits from these same drugs transactions that they also collaborated with and colluded to dispense within the borders of the United States of America. It is my conclusion that they are acting outside of their authority to arrest and further incarcerate these same individuals referred to as drug dealer and kingpins. Then they used these same laws to violate the civil and constitutional rights of these so-called drug dealers and kingpins for participating in the furtherance of the criminal activities in the RICO Act that originated from the activities of members of the United States of America, including but not limited to the President of the United States of America, Ronald Wilson Reagan himself, and various other members of military and federal law enforcement agencies. It is also my contention and my opinion that the actual RICO Act was committed by high-level officials of the United States military and federal law enforcement agencies that actually transported these illegal drugs across and into the borders of the United States of America using military and government vehicles paid for by the taxpayers of the United States citizens. The act of arresting individuals commonly known as drug dealers and drug kingpins, therefore, should be considered unconstitutional because they are furthering the alleged conspiracy allocating and transferring the same drugs that originated from the same actions of the United States of America's military and federal law enforcement agencies. Both parties are involved in the same scheduled movements of the same drugs. So, therefore, how is one party involved in criminal activity while the other party is not involved in the same criminal act? To arrest these alleged drug dealers and drug kingpins creates a very obvious conflict of interest. Therefore, to deprive these individuals of their life, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness should be considered unconstitutional on those grounds alone. One party should not be arrested while the other entity or enterprise is not arrested for essentially performing the same movement of the same exact drug products while acting together in same alleged act of conspiracy. Furthermore, the laws of this great nation should be executed fairly and equally, or they should not be enforced at all. This produces an apparent and unequal distribution of justice and execution of the laws formed through legislation. It also shapes a very unfair playing field with two very different sets of rules. This also fashions a clear and present civil and constitutional violation. And to add insult to injury, the locale, state, and federal legislators are working together with its law enforcement agencies to enforce, legislate, and execute all of these goings on while simultaneously eluding, evading, and circumventing this same alleged pattern of criminal conduct. It realistically does not make any sense to me at all. It actually leads me to more questions than actual answers. This is a very good reason to make these actions unconstitutional and look into the arrests, prosecutions, and convictions of most of the defendants who were sent into the prison industrial system for distributing and trafficking the drugs that were provided to them by the United States of America's military and federal law enforcement agencies who brought them into and across them. United States borders via military-issued vehicles and modes of transportation, the very same people who were personally responsible for flooding America with illegal drugs under the umbrella of the United States federal government, were the very same people who also made claims that they were fight a war won, low, middle, and high-level drug dealers, traffickers, and kingpins. George Herbert Walker Bush himself made a very famous statement about it. The war on drugs, which rings very differently in our ears in today's climate, after finding out the level of involvement of Ronald Reagan, Oliver North, and several other military, legislative, and law enforcement officials and agencies associated directly with the United States military officials. This is the first time since taking the oath of office that I felt an issue was so important, so threatening, that it warranted talking directly with you, the American people. All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs. Drugs have strained our faith in our system of justice. Our courts, our prisons, our legal system are stretched to the breaking point. The social costs of drugs are mounting. In short, drugs are saping our strength as a nation. Turn on the evening news or pick up the morning paper, and you'll see what some Americans know just by stepping out their front door. Our most serious problem today is cocaine, and in particular, crack. Who's responsible? Let me tell you straight out. Everyone who uses drugs, everyone who sells drugs, and everyone who sells drugs, and everyone who looks the other way. Tonight, I will tell you how many Americans are using illegal drugs. I will present to you our national strategy to deal with every aspect of this threat. And I will ask you to get involved in what promises to be a very difficult fight. This is crack cocaine seized a few days ago by Drug Enforcement Administration agents in a park just across the street from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or CP. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it is turning our cities into battle zones, and it is murdering our children. Let there be no mistake. This stuff is poison. Some used to call drugs harmless recreation. They're not. Drugs are real and terribly dangerous threat to our neighborhoods, our friends, and our families. On October 14, 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs, doubling down on an initiative that was started by Richard Nixon. Reagan declared that illicit drugs were a direct threat to U.S. national security, and through a series of legislation, like the mandatory minimum sentencing laws of 1986, made a hard right turn away from a public health approach to drug use. Drug offenders face lifetime consequences for minor infractions. Yet the focus on tough sentences for crack and not powder cocaine meant the people going to prison were largely black and brown. The media seemed to play along, hyping up threats with racist coverage that largely ignored rampant cocaine use amongst whites and sensationalized the crack problem in inner-city black neighborhoods. In his effort to make America great again, yes, that was originally a catchphrase from Reagan's stump speeches, Reagan enlisted his wife Nancy. The First Lady orchestrated the Just Say No program, which became a cornerstone of her legacy. But that tagline, while memorable, was a flop when it came to helping kids cope with complex situations. Meanwhile, the U.S. government put money and military resources behind Central American groups known to be trafficking cocaine, which played a major role in the creation of America's inner-city crack cocaine problem. Act 1. Building hysteria about the crack epidemic. Racist ideas distorted drug policies in Reagan's America. A media frenzy around the crack epidemic created a hysteria that meant support for his law and order policy approach to drug use. Prison populations soared as African Americans were targeted by law enforcement, despite using drugs at similar rates to whites. Act 2. Cocaine's okay as long as you're fighting communists. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan enacted harsh sentencing laws for drug offenders. Yet, under his watch, the CIA was actually funding some of the very drug cartels responsible for flooding inner-city America with cocaine. Act 3. Just Say Blow. In 1987, actress Drew Barrymore signed an anti-drug pledge alongside First Lady Nancy Reagan. As part of the ongoing Just Say No program that capitalized on pop culture stars like Barrymore and the cast of sitcom Different Strokes. The only problem was that Barrymore, like many of the celebrities Mrs. Reagan recruited for her anti-drug effort, was still abusing drugs at the time. In the end, Nancy Reagan's Just Say No program was considered a massive failure. Kids needed more than a simplistic tagline to deal with a complex reality. In September of 1986, President Ronald Reagan, alongside his wife Nancy, spoke to the nation in regard to their combined support to create strategies and policies that would work to combat the growing issue of drug abuse in America. As Nancy promised to continue to spread awareness of the dangers of drugs to American youth through campaigns such as Just Say No, the president informs of his new proposals that will work to combat the epidemic of drug use and create a safer nation. This legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, became law a month later, increasing penalties for drug possession, creating minimum sentences for drug-related offenses, increasing funds for drug enforcement measures, and importantly resulted in the creation of a disparity of 101 for crimes related to crack versus powdered cocaine. In June of 1986, two widely known athletes in the United States died in less than 2 weeks of each other, both as a result of cocaine overdoses. The tragic deaths of Cleveland Browns football player Don Rogers and the University of Maryland basketball star Lynn Bias, two talented young men in their prime, sparked a media uproar that government action needed to happen immediately to prevent more unnecessary destruction. This led to the expedition of the passing of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, legislation that would gain a legacy of controversy. Crack cocaine, given that it is much cheaper to produce, was utilized more heavily in areas of low socioeconomic status, consisting primarily of minority groups. Powdered cocaine was significantly more expensive and therefore used by predominantly upper-class white Americans, individuals that were far less likely to be policed in the forefront and further improbable to receive harsh punishment if they were charged with a drug-related crime. The 1986 bill created minimum sentencing laws with a 101 disparity between powder and crack cocaine, supported by untrue claims that crack is more dangerous and addictive, while there is pharmacologically no difference in effects between the two forms. Possession of 5 grams of crack, approximately 0.18 Oz, would lead to a 5-year minimum sentence, and 50 grams, approximately 1.8 Oz, would elicit a 10-year minimum sentence. An individual possessing powdered cocaine would have to have 100 times as much to trigger the same penalty. These were justified through the assertion that mandatory minimums would greatly reduce the number of large-scale drug traffickers, but in reality, most often affected users and street dealers. This disparity overall led to a major racial and class imbalance where minorities faced exorbitantly harsher punishment for use and sale of virtually the same drug as their affluent white counterparts. The extreme actions taken against crack, specifically alongside the continued media hype of the dangers of the drug, led to the major focus of public attention and militarized police efforts to be on the inner cities, which had naturally formed a market around the profitable drug. Meanwhile, suburban and upper-class users of powdered cocaine were largely ignored in policy, media portrayals, and enforcement measures. An additional aspect of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was that it made the forfeiture of property much easier by law, specifically allowing for the seizure of belongings equating to the value of illegal goods if those substances were no longer available. Consequently, state legislatures similarly expanded their search and seizure policies in congruence with increased law enforcement efforts. This is just one example of how Reagan's policies did not unilaterally affect federal regulations, but were further influential in shaping state and local strategies. In Michigan, almost immediately after Reagan announced his national initiatives, state departments with ties to public health and narcotics were urging the initiation of comprehensive tactics to begin the attack on drugs at the state level. The 1986 Act was just the beginning. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 was signed 2 years later, which furthered many of these measures, and actions continued into the early 1990s. It is evident that, through the late 80s, crack specifically continues to be considered the more serious and problem, causing drug, and a main reason to amp up the national war. As funding for drug-fighting programs increased, there was a trend towards using this money for increased policing and expansion of the criminal justice system, as opposed to efforts for rehabilitation. Just say no sounds just fine as the advice given to privileged youngsters who are offered candy by strangers. But when the First Lady suggests the phrase as a final solution to youthful drug abuse, it smacks of a gross ignorance of street addiction, peer pressure, and the agony that drives poor children especially to the bottle, the needle, and the pipe. While the deaths of famous figures may have been an important spark in hastening public outrage, Nancy Reagan had been influencing perceptions of the gravity of drug use from the early 1980s through her Just Say No movement, a campaign that would define her time as First Lady, but would also be criticized for its obtuse nature and overall ineffectiveness. Nancy traveled around the country to schools, rehabilitation centers, and anti-drug rallies, as well as appearing on television and radio to spread the message that drug abuse could be largely averted by simply refuse the proposition of trying drugs. Just say no. Clubs were implemented in schools and communities nationwide, with kids encouraged to pledge that they would resist the pressures and temptations of drug use. Overall, this strategy grossly simplified the solution to decreasing adolescent drug use and was shown to be a largely ineffective form of preventative education. It was further criticized in terms of ignoring the real systemic causes of drug use in lower-class areas where the issue was most prevalent. When Bush took office, the federal drug control budget was around $5 billion. When he left office in 1993, it was over $12 billion. This was the sharpest escalation in the history of the drug war, and it locked the country into a strategy of punishment, deterrence. This is a very important aspect, which is a hidden agenda used by local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies to essentially steal the assets of people who use the method of selling drugs in order to escape poverty and reward the very same government officials and agencies who were basically doing the very same thing while they were under the protection of the United States government. They are doing the exact same thing without any fear of being arrested or prosecuted, which, in my opinion, contradicts the very same laws enacted by congressmen and senators. And this disparity brings into play the validity of the American justice system that pretty much invalidates all of the drug-related offenses which end up in the arrests, prosecutions, and subsequent incarcerations of all of the United States citizens, because using the same logic and way of thinking as the local, state, and federal agencies and officials who have been affiliated and associated in the distribution and trafficking of various drugs are not being arrested, prosecuted, and prosecuted for the same pattern of behavior that encompasses the alleged selling, distributing, and trafficking of the very same illegal drugs. These government agencies and officials are directly responsible for flooding the borders of America with a large percentage of these same illegal drugs that they are prosecuting its very own citizens for being tangled up in the same conspiracy to do the exact same thing that they are doing. So, in my mind, they should be treated equally, and the Supreme Court of the United States should therefore vacate the sentences of any United States citizen who have been arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for any drug-related offense, including selling, distributing, trafficking, manufacturing, and possessing any and all substances classified as illegal drugs under the locale, state, and federal guidelines and statutes. If all of the members of law enforcement and military agencies are allowed to freely perform these same actions without any fear of being arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned, then all of the other citizens of this great nation should be afforded these same privileges. Otherwise, all of these same movements and patterns of behavior should be considered to be legally sanctioned equally under the provisions of the United States Constitution. Two separate ways of interpreting and enforcing drug laws should not exist. The members of the locale, state, and federal agencies, officials, and governments should be held accountable for their movements in the illegal drug trade, and they also should not be considered to be above the law or immune to the same penalties for their exact same participation in the exact same involvement in criminal acts performed by them in furtherance of drug selling, distribution, manufacturing, trafficking, and possession. This creates an unfair advantage and implementation of the drug laws, and it also creates an apparent imbalance in the validity and constitutional execution of the drug laws that have been enacted in the United States. These drug laws have targeted African and Latino males at an alarming rate. This has led to mass incarceration rates within the inner city and urban population at a disproportionate degree, frequency, and percentage. President Clinton signed into law legislation that would maintain stiff prison sentences for those convicted of possessing or trafficking in small amounts of crack cocaine over the objections of some civil rights groups and the Congressional Black Caucus. In taking the action Clinton aligned himself with congressional Republicans who rejected recommendations by the U.S. Sentencing Commission to lower the prison terms for offenses involving crack cocaine to make them the same as offenses involving powder cocaine to make them the same as offenses involving powder cocaine. The penalties, which Clinton's action endorsed, have been criticized for the disparity between the punishment for those convicted of possessing or selling crack cocaine, who generally are black, and those dealing in powder cocaine, who generally are white. Crack cocaine is a form of cocaine cooked with baking soda that is cheaper and more accessible than powder cocaine. Possession of 5 grams of crack brings a mandatory 5-year prison term, while possession of the same amount of powder cocaine draws a 1-year sentence. Trafficking in 5 grams of crack brings the same 5-year prison term as trafficking in 500 grams of powder cocaine, creating what critics called a 100. Critics accuse Clinton of making a purely political call, fearful of looking soft on crime. Jesse L. Jackson, who last week met with White House Deputy Chief of Staff Harold Ickes to lobby in favor of changing the penalties, said yesterday that Clinton's decision was a moral disgrace. Jackson said, "Clinton is willing to sacrifice young black youth for white fear," and added, "There are those inside the White House who are willing to write off the black Democratic vote to look tough to white Republican voters." He said Clinton and Reno both know that crack is code for black, and that in rejecting a change, the Clinton administration is consciously and with political intent playing to white conservative voters with a Republican anti-crime agenda. The Congressional Black Caucus sent Clinton a letter arguing that the disparities make a mockery of justice because they fuel the appearance of unfairness by undermining faith in equal protection under the law. The disparities provoked an impassioned debate in Congress, with some arguing that crack cocaine is more psychologically addicting and more associated with violent crimes. But others argued that the disparities for the same drug were a function of wealthy whites protecting their children. If somebody is convicted of selling $225 worth of crack cocaine, they get the same penalty as somebody who sells $50,000 worth of powder cocaine. Rep. Melvin Watts said, "Poor young kids who can afford only crack go to jail. Rich young kids who can afford powder go home and sleep in their own beds." Riots at several federal prisons were attributed, at least in part, to anger over the sentencing disparities after the House last month refused to accept the recommendations to equalize the base penalty for crack and cocaine crimes. Since the riots and anticipating disturbances in the wake of Clinton's decision, the Justice Department has taken steps to upgrade the level of security at federal prisons. The former president made sure low-level drug users felt the full weight of state power at the same moment bankers saw the shackles that bound them removed. There is indeed something worth criticizing when a Democratic president signs on to a national frenzy for punishment and endorses things like 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, and truth in sentencing. But what is most shocking in our current historical understanding of the Clinton years is the idea that the mass imprisonment of people of color was an unintended consequence of the 1994 crime bill, to quote the New York Daily News's paraphrase of Hillary Clinton. This is flatly, glaringly false, as the final, ugly chapter of the crime bill story confirms. Civil rights organizations had led a telephone campaign to pressure the president to veto the bill. At a rally in Chicago, the Rev. Jesse L. Jackson said that Mr. Clinton had the chance, with one stroke of your veto pen, to correct the most grievous racial injustice built into our legal system, to address the disparity and perhaps racial bias in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act, FA, of 2010 into federal law. Before the SSA, The sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine was 100. The act also eliminated the 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for simple crack cocaine possession.